There's a kind of quiet that isn't peace. I learned that the winter a woman walked out of the salt flats with no voice in her throat and no name I could give her, and I spent 3 seasons trying to guess what had been done to make a person go so silent. Folks in Dry Fork said she was touched, or cursed, or dangerous. I kept my mouth shut and my ledger open, because I've always trusted numbers more than gossip, and numbers told me she'd walked 40 miles without water and hadn't died, which meant she had a reason to live that was stronger than her body's opinion on the matter. I thought I was keeping her alive out of decency. I found out later I was keeping her alive because some accounts a man carries never close on their own, and hers was written in the same book as mine, in a hand I'd been pretending for 11 years I couldn't read. She never said a word to me, not one, but before the snow came the third time, she pressed a folded scrap of paper into my palm, closed my fingers over it, and looked at me the way you look at somebody you've decided to forgive before they've earned it. And when I finally opened it and read what was written there, I understood that everything I'd counted in my whole life had been the wrong column. This is what the note said, and this is what it cost me to be the one holding it. The dog started it, which is the only reason I was even looking west that morning. I keep a ledger, have since I was a boy, a habit my mother left me before the fever took her, when she taught me that a thing written down couldn't be argued with later. Most men keep accounts for money. I keep mine for money too, but there's a back section, the last pages, where I set down another kind of tally, and I don't show that part to anybody. That morning I had the front pages open on the fence rail, working out what the winter feed would run me. When Bishop, that's the dog, a bad-tempered blue heeler who hated everyone including me, went stiff and pointed his nose at the flats and made a sound low in his chest that I'd only heard him make around rattlers and dead things. I looked where he looked. Heat was already coming up off the salt in those shimmers that turn a fence post into a walking man. For a while I told myself that's all it was, a trick of the ground. But the shape kept coming, and it didn't waver the way a mirage wavers, and after a bit I could see it was a person, and after a bit longer I could see it was a person who had no business still being upright. I want to set this down plain because I've heard the story told a dozen ways in the years since, and every one of them makes me out to be kinder than I was. The truth is my first thought wasn't mercy. My first thought was trouble, because the way she was dressed, even from that distance, even ruined by the walk, that was not a settler woman. That was Apache. And in Dry Fork in the year 1879, an Apache walking in out of the flats was the kind of thing that emptied the saloon and filled the street, and never once ended with everybody going home happy. So I stood there. God help me, I stood at my own fence and watched a human being die by inches for a good long minute while I did arithmetic in my head, and none of the numbers were about her. They were about me, what it would cost me, what Halloran would say, whether the men who'd elected to hate the Apache long before I ever came to this country would decide I'd joined the wrong side. Then she fell. Just went down, the way a marionette goes down when you cut it, all at once and wrong. And she didn't put her hands out, and something about that, a person too far gone to even brace their own fall, got me over the fence and running before I'd decided to. She weighed nothing. That's the thing I remember from carrying her, that I could feel every bone through the leather of her sleeve, that her wrist in my hand was like a bundle of dry reeds. Her lips had split and gone black. There was salt-crusted white in the creases of her neck. But her eyes were open, and they were tracking me, and when I got her into the shade of the barn and got water to her mouth, she didn't gulp at it the way a dying thing gulps. She took it careful, in sips, like somebody who knew exactly how fast a body can drink after too long dry, and knew that too fast would kill her surer than the thirst. That was the first thing I learned about her without a single word passing between us. She was not helpless. She had chosen every step of that 40 miles. She had rationed her own dying. "You got a name?" I asked her when she'd had enough that I figured she'd live to sundown. She looked at me, nothing. "You understand me?" Her eyes moved, not a nod, not a shake, just a flicker, like she was setting me on a shelf to be considered later. And her mouth opened. I watched her try. I watched the muscles in her throat work, watched her lips shape the front of some word, and watched nothing come out, not a whisper, not a rasp. Her hand came up to her own throat, flat against it, pressing the way you press on a wound, and her face did a thing I've never been able to describe right. It wasn't shame, and it wasn't grief exactly. It was the specific hopelessness of somebody who has tried a door 1,000 times and knows it's locked, but tries it anyway because the not trying is worse. She couldn't speak. I told myself it was the thirst. A throat that dry, of course it wouldn't work. Give it a day. I gave it a day, then a week, then a month. And she never once made a sound above the small ones a body can't help, the catch of breath, the swallow, the involuntary hitch when she moved a hurt shoulder wrong. But words, no. Whatever had taken her voice had taken it whole and taken it before the flats. The walk hadn't done it. She'd walked in already silent. I should tell you about Dry Fork, because Dry Fork is half this story whether I like it or not. It wasn't much. A church that doubled as a schoolhouse, a mercantile run by a widow named Prout who'd have sold cannonballs to both sides of a war and thanked you for the trade, a saloon, a smithy, and Halloran. When I say Halloran, I mean the man, and I mean the idea of him both, because Cyrus Halloran owned the biggest spread in the valley and had put up the money for the church and the well and the little iron fence around the burying ground, and a town that owes a man that much starts to see through his eyes without noticing it's happening. Halloran was a big, genial, gray-headed man who shook your hand with both of his and remembered your children's names. And he was the reason there wasn't a single Apache alive within 100 miles of Dry Fork who'd walk toward it instead of away. That's the part the town told with pride. There'd been a battle, they said, back in '68, before my time. Well, not before my time in the country, but before my time here, up at a place they called Whistler's Draw. The Apache had been raiding, they said. Halloran had raised a company of men, they said, and they'd gone up and settled it, and there hadn't been trouble since. And every year on the anniversary, the town had a supper and Halloran stood up and said a few words about the price of peace, and everybody clapped, and the children were let out of school. I clapped too the first couple of years. It's easy to clap. You clap and you belong. I bring Halloran up now, this early, because the second day the woman was in my barn. Prout's boy came out on a mule to fetch a sack of nails his mother had put on my account, and he saw her. Saw her sitting up against a hay bale with a blanket around her, mending the tear in my saddle blanket with a bone needle she'd found somewhere and asked me for with a gesture, pointing at the tear. Then at her own hands, a whole negotiation without a syllable. The boy saw her, and his face did the thing faces do, and he was back on that mule and gone before I could say a word, and I stood in my barn door and watched the dust of him go, and I knew. I knew the next dust that came up that road wouldn't be a boy on a mule. It was Halloran himself and 4 men, and it was the next afternoon. I met them in the yard. I had my hand near my rifle, which I want to be honest about, because I don't fully know now whose side I thought I was on when I put it there. Halloran got down off his horse, a fine gray. He always rode gray, and he shook my hand with both of his and asked after my winter feed like we'd met on the church steps. Then he said, easy as anything, "Word is you got yourself a squaw out of the flats, wheeze." I didn't like the word. I found that out about myself in that second, that I didn't like it in his mouth. I said she'd walked in half dead, and I'd given her water, which was what any man would do. Any man, Halloran agreed, still smiling. Sure, Christian thing. He looked past me at the barn. Where'd she come from, you figure? Didn't say. Ask her. She can't say, I told him. She's got no voice, something took it. And I watched him. I've spent 11 years since replaying the next half-second, and I'll tell you what I saw, and you can decide what it meant, because I've decided and undecided 100 times. When I said she had no voice, Cyrus Halloran's smile stayed exactly where it was, but something behind his eyes went very still. The way water goes still right before something under the surface moves. It was there and gone. Then he laughed, a warm, big laugh, and said, "Well, that's a mercy for your ears, then," and the men laughed, and the moment closed over like it had never been. But I'd written it down already, not on paper. In the back pages of the other ledger, the one in my head. Halloran, hearing she can't speak, relieved. I didn't know yet why a man would be relieved to learn a stranger couldn't talk. I just knew relief when I saw it, because I'd felt it myself often enough about things I shouldn't have. He told me, real friendly, that I'd want to move her along before the snow. That folks got nervous. That he'd hate for there to be any trouble on my account, me being a good neighbor and all. And he got back on his gray, and he and his 4 men rode off, and not one of them had raised a voice or a hand, and I stood in my yard feeling like I'd just been threatened by a man handing me a plate of pie. I went back in the barn. She was watching the door. She'd heard all of it. I could tell she understood English fine. Whatever the mission or the trading post or the war had taught her, she understood every word. And she was looking at me with a question that didn't need sound. What did you tell them? Told them you can't talk, I said. Her hand went to her throat again, but this time it wasn't the hopeless press. This time her fingers curled, slow, like she was closing them around something. And she nodded, one small nod, the first she'd given me, and I understood, the way you understand a thing before you have the words for it, that her not being able to talk was the only reason Cyrus Halloran had gotten back on his horse. Now here is where I have to tell the part about me, because a man who only tells the parts that make him look good is just building himself a monument, and I've seen enough of those. I said I came to this country before Whistler's Draw. That's true. What I didn't say, what I've never said to a living soul until I'm setting it down here, is that in the summer of 1868 I was 19 years old and I was a wrangler. A good one. I could gentle anything on 4 legs, and men with hard uses for horses paid for that skill and didn't ask my politics. And I didn't have any politics. I had a dead mother and an empty pocket and a talent, and that was the whole of me. Cyrus Halloran hired me that summer to keep the remuda for a company of men riding up toward the mountains. I didn't ask what for. That's the truth, and it's also the sin, because a man who doesn't ask has decided he doesn't want to know, and not wanting to know is its own kind of answer. I kept the horses. I hobbled them at night and grained them and doctored a split hoof, and I stayed with the animals the way a wrangler does, back at the camp, while the men rode up the draw before dawn. I heard it, you could hear it from the camp. It went on longer than a battle goes on. A battle, the real kind, the kind I heard later in the nations, it comes in bursts and then it's spent. This went on, and it wasn't two-sided if you understand me. There's a sound to shooting when it's being shot back, and there's a different sound when it isn't. And I was 19, and I didn't have the word for it yet, but my body knew. My hands knew on the horses' lead ropes. And I stood in that camp with the animals stamping and rolling their eyes at the noise, and I did not saddle a horse, and I did not ride up that draw. When the men came back down, they were quiet in the particular way men are quiet when they've done a thing they'll spend the rest of their lives not talking about. And there were things tied to some of the saddles that I made myself not look at. And Halloran paid me my wage in the firelight, and it was more than we'd agreed, and I understood the extra without a word being said about it. And I took it. I took it. I left the next morning, rode south and didn't stop for 3 days and told myself I was just a wrangler. I just kept the horses. I never fired a shot. I never even saw. And that was all true, and none of it was the truth. And I've kept a page in the back of my ledger for 11 years with one figure on it that never balances. And I have never once been able to write down what the debt was against, because I couldn't make myself put the words Whistler's Draw on paper in my own hand. So when a silent Apache woman walked out of the salt flats and fell down in front of my fence, and when Cyrus Halloran rode out to see her and went still behind the eyes when he heard she couldn't speak, you understand that I was not a stranger to any of it. I was the wrangler. I had always been the wrangler. I just spent 11 years pretending the horses had nothing to do with the draw. She stayed. Snow or no snow, Halloran or no Halloran, she stayed, and I'll tell you it wasn't entirely my doing. By the time she was strong enough to walk out, she'd made herself into the spine of the whole place. She mended what was torn, and she found water sign I'd have missed, and she doctored Bishop's cracked pad with a poultice that had that miserable dog following her around like she'd hung the moon. She kept a fire better than I ever had. She did all of it without a sound, and after a while the silence stopped feeling like an absence and started feeling like a language I was slowly learning to read. The tilt of her head that meant you're doing that wrong, the flat of her hand that meant wait, the way her whole face could open up, just for a second, when Bishop did something foolish before it closed back down again. I gave her a name in my head because I had to call her something and she couldn't give me the real one. I never said it out loud. I just wrote it in the front ledger where I wrote everything next to the feed costs and the fence wire. She mended the east gate. She found the seep spring. She hasn't slept a whole night yet. I hear her up in the dark. I told myself I was keeping accounts. I know now I was keeping company, in the only way I knew how, which was with a pen. The nights were the worst of it for her. I'd hear her not crying, she never made a sound even then, but I'd hear her get up and move to the door and stand there, and I'd hear her breathing go fast and shallow and then slow again as she took hold of herself. And one night I got up too, and I found her standing in the open door looking north. Just north, toward the mountains, toward the draw, though I didn't let myself think the word. I didn't touch her. I'd learned not to come up on her from behind or move fast in her sight. I just came and stood a way off so she'd know I was there, and I said the only thing I had. I can't fix it, I said. Whatever it is, I know that. I ain't going to pretend I can. She didn't look at me, but after a while her hand came out, palm down in the dark between us, wait, or maybe stay. I couldn't tell which, and maybe it was both. And we stood there in the cold doorway, the two of us not touching, looking at a north neither of us would say out loud, and I understood that we were keeping the same watch. I just didn't understand yet that we were mourning the same night. The first note came in October. I'd taught her letters, no, that's a lie, and I said I wouldn't tell it prettier than it was. She already had her letters. The mission at San Xavier, or one like it, had taught her to write a fair hand years before. And one evening I came in and found she'd taken a stub of my pencil and a torn corner off the back of my own ledger. She'd learned where I kept it, learned it mattered to me, and she'd written, in careful schoolroom letters, "Thank you, I will go before the snow. You should not pay for me." I read it 3 times. You should not pay for me. Like she knew there was a price on the whole arrangement. Like she'd been doing her own arithmetic all along, same as me, sitting silent by my fire, adding up what her presence was costing a man who had to live in Dry Fork after she was gone. "You're not going anywhere before the snow," I said. "You'll die out there, and then I'll have carried you 40 miles for nothing, and I don't do things for nothing. Bad for the accounts." She looked at me a long time. Then she reached over and, slow, deliberate, she took the pencil and she wrote one more word under the first and turned the paper to me. "Why?" Not a question mark, just the word flat, the way she did everything. Why? Why keep her? Why cross Halloran? Why a white man in this country would sit at a fire with an Apache woman and teach a mean dog to love her and say you're not going anywhere? And I stood there with her why in my hand, and 11 years of a debt I couldn't name sitting in the back of my ledger, and I could not tell her. I could not make my own mouth do the thing hers couldn't. I could not say Whistler's Draw to her any more than I could write it. I opened my mouth and I understood, standing there, that in the one way that mattered I was every bit as voiceless as she was, and had been longer. So I did the coward's honest thing. I took the pencil from her hand, and under her why in my own bad letters I wrote the only true answer I had, which was, "Because I owe somebody, and you're who walked in." She read it, and something in her face changed, not softened exactly, sharpened, like a person who'd been reading a book in bad light and finally got it near the lamp. She looked at me like she was seeing the back pages of me for the first time, the ones I don't show anybody, and I had the sudden cold feeling that she'd known how to read those pages all along, and had only been waiting to see whether I'd hand them over. She folded the paper, she kept it, and she went to her blanket and lay down with her back to me, and I sat up the rest of that night with the fire and the dog and the arithmetic that never balanced, and I did not sleep, and neither, I think, did she. I didn't know it yet, but she'd started writing the note that would end everything that October night, the second she saw the word O in my hand. The first real snow came the way the worst things always come out here, quiet, and then all at once, and then like it had never intended to stop. I was 3 miles from the house when it started, out checking the seep spring she'd found, because the cattle had been drifting that way and I wanted to know if the water would hold or freeze. The sky had that low pewter look all morning. I should have turned back at noon. I didn't, because I was working a figure in my head about how many head I could carry through to spring, and a man doing arithmetic doesn't watch the sky. By the time I looked up, the whole world had gone white and sideways, and I couldn't see Bishop 10 feet ahead of me. Only heard him, a short, sharp bark, then another pulling me on. I want to tell you I found my way home by skill. The truth is that dog took me home. He'd run ahead till I lost him, then double back and bark till I caught up, then run ahead again, a living rope hauling me through a whiteout I had no business surviving. And when the barn came up out of the snow like a ship out of fog, there was a lantern hung in the door. She'd hung it. She couldn't have known I'd be fool enough to be out, but the light was there. And when I stumbled in, she was standing by it with a wool blanket already in her hands and her face doing that thing, not relief. She never let it get all the way to relief, but the front edge of relief, the part a person can't stop before it shows. She wrapped the blanket around me and pushed me toward the fire, and she was angry. I could see she was angry. Her jaw was tight and her movements were hard. And I understood I was being scolded in the only language she had. And I let her do it, because being scolded meant somebody had been afraid for me, and it had been a long time since anybody had bothered. "I know," I said through teeth that wouldn't stop. "I know, fool thing." She jabbed a finger at the window, at the storm, then at me, then made a fist and pressed it flat against her own chest, hard, deliberate. It took me a second. You, frightened. Me, 3 words, no sound, and the last one landed somewhere I hadn't kept clear for anybody in 11 years. I turned my face to the fire so she wouldn't see it, and I wrote in the ledger that night when my hands could hold the pencil again. Snow came. She hung a light, just that. But I underlined it, which I have never done before or since in all the years of that book, and I don't fully know why except that some entries you want to be able to find again in the dark. The snow shut us in for 11 days. 11 days is a long time to share a small, warm space with a person you cannot fully speak to. It does one of 2 things. It either wears the 2 of you raw, every habit grinding on the other, or it teaches you a closeness that talk would only have gotten in the way of. With us it was the second, and I've thought since that maybe her silence was the reason. There's a kind of quiet honesty that comes when you can't fill the room with words. You have to actually watch a person. You learn what the set of their shoulders means before coffee and after. You learn that she liked the fire built high and hot, and that she hated the way I let it burn down to save wood, and that she'd get up in the night and feed it herself rather than wake to a cold room, and that this had nothing to do with cold and everything to do with some old memory of being cold and unable to fix it. We built a way of talking. It started with the notes and grew past them. She'd draw in the ash on the hearthstone with a stick, quick pictures, a whole conversation in a picture. She showed me she'd had 2 brothers with a stick figure drawing and then wiped one away with the flat of her hand and left the ash smeared where he'd been and looked at me, and I understood a death without a word for it. She showed me she knew horses, drew a horse, then drew herself on it, then drew the horse rearing and herself staying on, and there was something in the cock of her head that was pure pride. Pure I could ride anything you ever broke, Cowboy, and I laughed out loud. The first real laugh I'd had in that house in years, and Bishop lifted his head off her foot and looked at both of us like we'd lost our minds. On the 6th night I saw the scar. She was reaching up to hang wet wash on the line I'd strung across the room, and her collar fell open, and the firelight caught it, and I looked before I could stop myself and then couldn't look away. It ran across the front of her throat, low, a ridge of old healed flesh gone shiny and pale, thick as a length of rawhide. Not a knife cut. A knife makes a line. This was wider than that, a band, the kind of mark a thing leaves when it's pulled tight all the way around and held there. The kind of mark a rope leaves. She saw me see it. Her hand came up and closed her collar, slow, no hurry, no shame. She'd made her peace with that scar long before she ever met me. But she held my eyes while she did it, and she let me understand this is why. Not a fever, not a curse. This. Somebody had put a rope on this woman's neck and pulled it and left her for dead. And she had lived, and the price of living had been every word she'd own for the rest of her life. I've broken a lot of things in my time, horses, promises, my own word once or twice. That night I broke a cup. Just picked it up to set it by the fire, and my hand closed too hard and it went to pieces. And I sat there looking at the shards of it in my palm. And she came and took them out of my hand, careful, one by one, like she was worried I'd cut myself, like I was the one who needed tending. And I let her. And I did not trust my voice. And I understood that somewhere in the back pages a figure I'd been carrying for 11 years had just gotten a great deal larger and a great deal more specific. Because I knew whose rope. God help me, before she ever wrote a word of it, some part of me already knew whose rope. The thaw came, and with the thaw came dry fork, and with dry fork came the anniversary. Every February the town held the supper. I told you about it, the one where Halloran stood up and said his few words about the price of peace. I'd gone every year. This year I didn't want to go, and not going would have been noticed, and a man in my position could not afford to be noticed, so I went. I left her at the house with the door barred, and the rifle where she could reach it, and Bishop with his ears already up. And I rode in through mud to sit at a long table under the church rafters and eat Prout's ham and clap at the right times. Halloran stood up, same as always. Big and gray and warm, both hands resting easy on the table, and he talked about the old days, about the courage it had taken, about how a country doesn't get civilized by wishing. He said the Apache had understood only one language, and that it had fallen to hard men to speak it so their children wouldn't have to. He said it kind. That was the thing about Halloran. He said terrible things kind, in a voice you'd want reading to you by a fire, and the whole room nodded, and the children who'd been let out of school ran between the tables, and somebody's baby laughed, and I sat there with a forkful of ham going cold in front of me, and I could not lift my hands to clap. I just couldn't do it. 11 years I'd done it. This year my hands lay in my lap like 2 dead things. because I had spent 11 days watching a woman feed a fire in the night so she'd never wake cold again, and I had seen the band of rope scar across her throat, and I could not put my hands together for the man who I now understood past any pretending had put it there. And I looked up from my dead hands, and Cyrus Halloran was looking straight at me across that whole crowded room. He didn't stop smiling. He didn't miss a beat of his speech, but he'd seen my hands in my lap, and he knew what still hands meant in a room full of clapping ones. And when he sat down to the town's applause, he lifted his cup to me down the length of the table, a little private toast, warm as anything, and it was the coldest thing anybody has ever done to me. Josiah Pruitt's widow caught me at the door on my way out. She was a hard old woman, but not a cruel one, and she'd sold me flour on credit through a bad year once and never spoke of it. And she put her hand on my sleeve and she said low, "Wesley, send that woman on before the melt's done. I don't say it to be unkind. I say it because I've buried men who crossed Cyrus, and I read the words at their graves myself, and every one of them thought they had more time than they did." And she patted my arm and went back into her ham, and I rode home through the dark with her words sitting on me like a wet coat. She was awake when I got back. Of course she was. She never slept till I was in. I barred the door and hung the rifle, and I stood there in the firelight and I looked at her, and I made a decision I'd been circling for weeks without letting myself land on it. I went to the shelf, and I took down the ledger, not the front, the back, the pages I'd never shown a living soul, and I sat down across the fire from her, and I opened it to the page with the figure that never balanced, the one I'd never been able to write a name against. And I turned it around and I held it out to her. She looked at the page. There was nothing on it she could read, really, just a number and a date and a blank where the account name should be. But she understood what it was to hold a book open to a page you've never shown anybody. She understood the offering of it. She took it in both hands, careful, the way she took everything that mattered, and she looked at the date I'd written there. 1868. I watched her read it. I watched the year go into her the way the word voice had gone into Halloran that first day, something behind her eyes going very still, water going still before the thing under it moves. Her thumb pressed down on the date. She looked up at me. And for the first time since she'd walked out of the flats, I saw fear in her face. Not fear of the storm or the town or Halloran, but fear of me, of what I might be, of whether the man who'd carried her 40 miles and taught his mean dog to love her was about to turn out to be a man she'd already met. "I kept the horses," I said. My voice came out of me like something being pulled up from a well that had gone dry a long time ago. "Whistler's Draw, 1868, Halloran's company. I was the wrangler. I kept the remuda back at the camp." I made myself hold her eyes. It was the hardest thing I have ever made myself do. "I heard it. I heard the whole of it, and I knew it wasn't a battle, and I stayed with the horses, and I took his money, and I rode south, and I have been paying on it ever since in a book nobody's ever seen but you. I wasn't up the draw. But I was the one that kept the horses ready so the men could get up it. So don't," and here my voice did break all the way through, "don't you sit at my fire thinking I saved you out of goodness. I don't have any. I've got a debt. That's all I've got. That's all I've ever had." The room was very quiet. The fire spat, Bishop's ear flicked. She sat there holding my open book, and then she did a thing I did not expect, a thing that undid me more thoroughly than anger would have. She closed the ledger, gentle. She set it down on the hearthstone between us like you'd set down something sleeping. And she reached across the fire and she took my hand. She'd never once touched me, not in all those weeks, not through the storm or the scolding or the scar. And she turned it palm up, and with one finger she wrote on my open palm, slow enough that I could feel each letter. "I-K-N-O-W. I know." I stared at my own hand like the word might still be sitting there. "You know what?" I said. "You know I—" She pressed her whole hand flat over my palm, closing it, the way she'd closed my fingers over things before. "Stop. Enough. I know." And she pointed at herself, and she pointed north. And she drew in the ash of the hearth, quick and sure, a horse, and then a girl on the horse. And then the horse falling, and the girl not staying on this time, the girl coming off, small in the ash. And around her she drew other small shapes falling, and then she wiped her hand flat across all of it and left the ash smeared gray and empty, the way she'd done for her dead brother, except this time she smeared out everything, the whole drawing, all the small falling shapes at once. Whistler's Draw. She had been there. She had been the girl on the horse. She had been up the draw while I was down at the camp with the animals, telling myself I couldn't see. We had been in the same place on the same morning 11 years ago. she at the killing end of it, and I at the other, tied together by the same ropes I'd hobbled the horses with, and she had walked 40 miles out of the salt flats and fallen down at the fence of the one man in that whole country who'd helped keep those horses ready. You didn't know, I said. When you walked in, you couldn't have known it was me. It's chance, it's just... She shook her head, slow, deliberate no. And she reached into the front of her dress, where she'd kept it all this time next to the rope scar, and she took out a folded piece of paper worn soft as cloth. And I saw it was the first note she'd ever written me, thank you. I will go before the snow. You should not pay for me, and underneath it in my own bad hand, because I owe somebody, and you're who walked in. She tapped the word owe, then she tapped her own eyes, then she tapped the word again. I saw that you owed, before you ever said it, that is why I stayed. She had known, not who I was, not the wrangler, not the horses, not yet. But she had read the debt on me the way I'd read the relief on Halloran, had seen a man carrying an unbalanced account, and had made a decision to sit down at his fire and wait for it to come out. Because a man who owes is a man who might, when it counts, be willing to pay. She hadn't walked in by chance. She'd walked in hunting for exactly one kind of man, and she'd found him at my fence, half by luck and half by a patience I still can't fully take the measure of. What do you want? I said. My voice was steady now. It had gone all the way through the breaking and come out the other side flat and clear. You didn't walk 40 miles to warm your hands. You came for something. Tell me what. And she picked up the pencil, and she began, for the first time, to write me something longer than a line. She wrote slow. Her hand was schoolroom careful, but the words came hard, and I understood they came hard because she was translating, out of whatever her own tongue had been, out of 11 years of silence, into the borrowed letters of the people who'd taken her voice. She wrote a few words and stopped and pressed her fist to her chest, that gesture the frightened one, except now I understood it was also how she braced herself to keep going. She wrote a few more. I did not read over her shoulder. I made myself sit back and let her work, and I fed the fire high and hot the way she liked it. And outside the thaw dripped off the eaves in the dark, and Bishop lay across the door with his chin on his paws and his eyes open, keeping the same watch we all seemed to keep in that house. It took her the better part of an hour to fill one side of the paper. When she was done, she didn't hand it to me. She held it in her lap and she looked at it, and then she looked at me, and there was a question in her face bigger than any she'd asked before, bigger than why, bigger than the fear when she'd read the date. And I understood the question was this: if I give you this, you will have to choose. And I have to know, before I give it to you, whether you are a man who keeps the horses, or a man who rides up the draw. Because that was the whole of it, wasn't it? That had always been the whole of it. 11 years ago, I'd had a chance to be one or the other, and I'd chosen the horses, chosen the not looking, chosen the extra pay and the firelight. And now a silent woman with a rope scar across her throat was sitting at my fire with a folded piece of paper in her lap, offering me the same choice a second time, the choice almost nobody in this life ever gets offered twice. And before she could hand it to me, before I could take it, before I could read whatever truth was going to end everything, Bishop came up off the floor in one motion with a snarl I'd never heard from him, low and vicious and afraid, and he was at the door with his hackles up a ridge down his whole spine. And through the barred door from out in the dark of the thawing yard came a voice I knew, warm as a fire, kind as anything, the coldest voice in that whole country. "Wheeze," Cyrus Halloran called, easy and pleasant. "Wheeze, it's late, I know, and I'm sorry to come on you in the dark, but I got to thinking after supper, about your still hands." A pause, the drip of the eaves, a horse shifting out there, and then another, more than one man, more than two. "You and me ought to talk about what that woman's been telling you. Open the door, son. Let's talk about it like neighbors." She was already folding the note back into the front of her dress, against the scar, against the place where she'd carried it all along. And she was looking at me, and her hand came up, palm down, in the firelight between us, the gesture from the doorway in the dark all those weeks ago. Wait, or maybe stay. I still couldn't tell which, and I understood I had until the count of about 3 to decide whether it was going to matter. I didn't open the door. I want that down first, because a man telling this kind of story is always tempted to make himself brave at the moment bravery would look best, and the truth is I didn't open it out of courage. I didn't open it because I was afraid, and because being afraid, for once in my life, pointed me the right way. 11 years ago, fear had made me stay with the horses. That same night I learned fear can also make you bar a door. "It's late, Cyrus," I called back, My voice came out steadier than I was. "I'm abed, come back in the daylight and we'll talk all you want." A silence, the drip off the eaves, then his laugh warmed through the wood. "Now, Wheeze, you and I both know a man doesn't bar his door against a neighbor unless he's got something behind it he don't want the neighbor to see." A pause, and when he spoke again, the warmth had thinned just slightly, like ice you can suddenly see the water through. "I'm not here for you, son. I got no quarrel with you. You kept my horses once and kept them well, and I've never forgot it. I'm here for her. Send her out and I'll ride off, and this'll be a thing we never speak of again. You have my word. You kept my horses once." He'd said it easy, like a kindness, and it went through me like a blade going the wrong way. Because that was the leash, wasn't it, that had always been the leash? He'd been holding the other end of it for 11 years, and I'd been wearing it and calling it a debt of my own. "You kept my horses. You took my money in the firelight. You're mine, Wheeze, the same as any man who rode up that draw, and you'll hand her out because you already handed out your soul back in '68, and this is just the balance owing." I looked at her across the fire. She had not moved to the rifle. She had not moved toward the back window, though we both knew it was there, though we both knew a woman who'd walked 40 miles out of the salt flats could go out a window and into the dark and be a mile gone before they knew it. She was sitting perfectly still with the folded note held in both hands, and she was watching me, and her face was doing something I had never once seen it do in all our weeks. It was asking, not commanding, not enduring, asking. And I understood what she was asking, because it was the same thing she'd been about to ask when she almost handed me the note. "Which man are you?" Except now there wasn't an hour to fill a paper. There was Cyrus Halloran in my yard with 3 or 4 men and a warm voice, and there was the count of about 3, and she was asking me the whole question in one look. I crossed to her, I knelt down, and I held out my open hand, palm up, the way she'd written "I know" into it, and I said, "Give it here, whatever it says, I'll read it after. But you tell me right now with your hand, is that the thing that stops him? Is that why you walked 40 miles? Because if it is, then he doesn't get you and he doesn't get it, and I don't much care anymore what that costs." She looked at my open hand a long moment. Then she put the note in it, and she folded my fingers closed over it, the way she'd folded them over the mending needle, over the shards of the cup, over her own "I know." And she nodded, one small nod, "Yes, that is the thing that stops him." Then she pointed at the note, and at me, and then north, but not the wild north of the mountains this time. She drew fast in the ash a square, a building, a flag over it, and a word she scratched underneath in her careful letters, pressing so hard the pencil nearly tore the ash-dusted stone. "Fort." The note was for the fort, for the army, for the men who'd have jurisdiction over what happened at Whistler's Draw, men who answered to a government back east that had, in those years, begun, slowly, unevenly, and only when the paperwork forced it, to take an interest in whether its citizens had massacred people it had signed treaties with. She hadn't walked out of the flats hunting a man who owed. She'd walked out hunting a witness, someone who'd been there, someone whose word, set beside hers, might make a piece of paper the army couldn't fold up and put in a drawer. She'd found the Wrangler, and the Wrangler was the only living white man who'd heard Whistler's Draw and could swear to what the sound of it had been. "Wheeze," Halloran called, and there was iron all the way through the warmth now. "I'm going to ask one more time as a friend. Here is the decision. I've told you there'd be one. There were 2, really, and this was the first, and I'll set it down exactly as it happened because I've spent a long time making sure I remember it exactly." I could hand her the note back, put her out the window into the dark, and let her run. She might make it. She'd made 40 miles before. The fort was 90, but she was the most determined creature I'd ever met, and if anyone alive could cross 90 miles of winter country on foot and half-starved, it was her. That was the safe choice, safe for me. Halloran wanted her, not the paper. If she was gone into the dark, he'd have no reason to burn my house down around me. I could keep the horses one more time. I was good at keeping the horses. Or I could send her out the back, into the dark, toward the fort, and I could keep the note, and walk out the front door with it. And let Cyrus Halloran and his men find a man standing in his own lit doorway holding the one piece of paper in the world that could hang them, so that every eye and every gun in that yard was on the paper and the fool holding it, and not on the dark behind the house where a silent woman was already running north. One of those choices got her caught. The other one got me killed, most likely, but bought her the dark and the head start and the 90 miles. I knelt there in the firelight and I did the arithmetic. For the first time in 11 years, I did the arithmetic and it came out clean. It balanced. The figure that had never balanced in the back of my ledger, that I'd never been able to write a name against. It turned out the name I couldn't write was hers, had always been hers, some her. One of the small shapes falling in the ash, and here she was grown and alive and asking me the only question that had ever mattered. And the debt could be paid in exactly one coin, and I finally had it in my pocket. I took her by the shoulders. She let me. I said, "Back window, go north. Don't stop for the light, don't stop for the noise, don't stop for anything you hear behind you, you understand me." Anything, and I pressed the note back into her hands, not the fort's, not mine, because it was hers, it had always been hers. She'd carried it against the scar for 11 years, and no man was going to take it from her now, not Halloran and not me. "You carry it in, your word and your scar and your own 2 hands, not mine. You don't need the wrangler, you never needed the wrangler, you just needed him to hold the door." She stared at me, and her face broke, all the way, for the first time, all the way to the bottom, past enduring, past the front edge of feeling she never let herself reach. Her mouth opened. And I watched her try, one last time, the way she'd tried that first day in the barn. I watched the muscles work in her ruined throat, watched her lips shape the front of a word, watched her reach for a voice that a rope had taken from her on a morning I'd spent with the horses. Nothing came. Nothing would ever come. But she'd tried for me to make a sound, and that was a thing she had not done for anyone in 11 years, and I understood it was the closest she could come to saying a name, and I understood the name was mine. "I know," I told her, gave her back her own 2 words. "I know, go." She went, out the window into the dark north, and Bishop. I'll swear this to my grave. Bishop looked at me once and then went out the window after her. That mean miserable dog. Because he'd made his own arithmetic and it hadn't come out in my favor either, and I was glad of it. I was so glad she wouldn't be alone in the dark with the cold. Then I picked up the lantern, and I unbarred my own front door, and I stepped out into the light of my own doorway holding one empty hand up open and easy, and the other hand down at my side closed around nothing at all, closed tight like it was hiding something, and I let Cyrus Halloran and his 4 men see the fist and think it held the paper. "Evening, Cyrus," I said. "She's not here, left 2 days ago north." But before she went, she gave me something to hold. I lifted the closed fist just slightly, just enough. "And I've been sitting in there all night reading it, and I think you and I better talk about Whistler's Draw. I have never in my life seen a warm man go cold so fast. The whole yard of them went still, that water before the thing moved, stillness. 5 men's worth of it at once. And every eye in that yard came to my closed fist and stayed there. And while it stayed there, it was not looking at the dark corner of the house where a woman and a dog were already 40 yards gone and running. That's the second decision, to make my empty hand the most interesting thing in the county for as long as I could. To be, for one night at long last, the man who rode up the draw, except the only body I brought up it was my own. I'm not going to tell you all of what happened in the yard. Partly because some of it I don't remember clean. There's a gap in me from about the moment Halloran's voice dropped its last warmth, and the next thing I hold clear is lying on my back in the cold mud looking up at the smoke of my own barn going up orange against the low clouds, and the sound of horses leaving hard, and a great deal of pain that seemed to belong to somebody else. And partly because the yard isn't the point. The yard was just the bill coming due, and I'd already decided I could afford it, and a man doesn't need to itemize a debt he was glad to pay. They didn't find her, that's the point. They tore the house apart, and they fired the barn, and they rode north hunting the wrong number of miles behind. And they never once thought to wonder why a man would stand in a lit doorway waving an empty fist, unless the paper was real. And in it, which meant they spent the whole night hunting a paper that was already 90 miles away in the front of a running woman's dress, against a scar Cyrus Halloran had put there himself, and never known she'd survived. I lived, I'll say that much, since I'm here setting it down. Prute's widow found me the next morning. She'd heard the horses in the night and waited for daylight like the hard, sensible woman she was. And she loaded me in her wagon and never asked me a single question. And when I tried to tell her, she put one flour-dusted hand flat on my chest and said, "I read the words at their graves, Wesley. I'd sooner not read yours." Hush now, and drove me to her own back room and kept me there through the fever. And that's a debt in the front of the ledger I'll be paying the rest of my days, and glad of it. It was near a year before I knew. You have to understand there was no way to know for a long time. A woman with no voice, running north into winter, The odds don't bear thinking on, and I did my share of not thinking on them, lying in Prout's back room, and then, when I could sit a horse again, riding a country that had gotten very careful around me, because a man who's crossed Cyrus Halloran and lived is a strange kind of leper. Halloran himself never came near me again. He didn't need to. He knew I couldn't prove the yard, my word against 5, and mine the word of a known Apache sympathizer now, a man who'd sheltered a squaw and gotten his barn burned for it. And the town had a version of that story ready-made that didn't require anyone to think too hard about February suppers. So I healed and I rebuilt the barn slow and alone, and I kept my ledger. And I did not let myself write her name in it because I still didn't have one. And I did not let myself write whether she made it because I couldn't have borne to see the question sitting there in ink with no answer under it. Then in the fall a soldier came. Not to me, to Prout's, where he'd stopped for feed, a young corporal with a dispatch case and a bored horse. And the Prout widow, being who she was, got to talking and got out of him without him ever knowing he'd been got at that there'd been a matter up before the commander at the fort that spring. An old matter, 68. A killing up a place called Whistler's Draw that the army had long marked hostiles, engaged and dispersed in its own books and had been content to leave marked so. Except a witness had come in. Walked in, the corporal said, all the way from the south, half dead in the winter. A woman. She couldn't speak, he said. Something wrong with her throat, some old injury. But she could write a fair hand, and she'd brought it all in writing, everything, dates and names and the number of the fallen and the manner of it. And she'd had a paper besides. A strange thing, he said, folded soft as cloth, worn near through, that she wouldn't let out of her own 2 hands even to the commander. And on it in 2 different hands were some words about owing, and she'd laid her own hand flat on it and would not be moved. And something about the way she wouldn't be moved had made the commander take her serious in a way the army did not, in those years, generally take her people serious. They'd opened it back up, the matter. It was, the corporal said, still open. Slow, the army was always slow, and there were men in that country who'd rather it went back to sleep, but open. And that was more than dispersed and closed, and it was more than anyone had managed in 11 years, and it had all of it walked in on the feet of one silent woman who wouldn't let a piece of paper out of her hands. She's still there, the widow asked him, careful, casual, passing him a second biscuit. The corporal didn't rightly know. She'd given her testimony and there'd been talk of sending her east under protection or west to people of hers, or he didn't know. Women like that, he said, not unkind, just young and certain the way the young are, they came and went. There was a dog with her, he remembered that. A blue heeler, bad-tempered thing. Bit the quartermaster. The Prout widow told me all of it that evening, sitting on my new-raised barn's threshold while I couldn't hardly breathe for the size of what she was saying. And when she got to the dog, she stopped, and she looked at me sideways, and this hard old woman who'd never in her life said a soft thing said, "Bit the quartermaster, Wesley," in a voice that was trying not to be gentle and failing. So I'd say she made it. I'd say she made it just fine. There was no note at the end. I want to be honest about that, because a neater story would have won, she'd have sent word. Some scrap of paper working its way south through a dozen hands to reach me. One more line in her careful schoolroom letters closing the account clean. There wasn't one, there was never one. I never saw her again, and I never learned the name I'd needed so badly to write in my ledger. And there are nights I'm not certain the corporal's woman was mine at all, except for the dog. Except for the dog, who bit the quartermaster, who I'd last seen going out a dark window after her because he'd done the arithmetic and it hadn't come out in my favor. So I never got a note at the end, but I'll tell you what I did with the account. I took down the back pages of the ledger, the secret ones, the ones I'd shown one living soul, and I found the figure that had never balanced, the 1868 with the blank where the name should go, and I sat a long time at my rebuilt fire with the pencil in my hand. And I did not write her name because I still didn't have it, and I'd stopped grieving that. Some accounts you carry open on purpose, because closing them would be a lie. But under the figure in my own bad hand, I wrote the only thing that was true. I wrote, paid. She carried it in herself. All I did was hold the door. And then, because it was true too, and because there was nobody left to hide the back pages from, I wrote one more line under that, and I've read it near every night since. On the nights the north wind comes down off the mountains, and I find myself standing in my own doorway looking at a dark I don't say out loud.